Why is the region becoming so important now, not only to the US, but many of its adversaries and allies? Like, what has changed in the last couple of decades?
Well, there's a lot more economic activity taking place above the Arctic Circle today. You have big power competition taking place because Russia, of course, is an Arctic country. The U.S., of course, being an Arctic power. China wants to be an Arctic power, but they geographically speaking anyway, they are not an Arctic country. It's actually worth probably pointing out to the listeners that there are 8 Arctic countries, and that is the U.S., Canada, Russia, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark because of Greenland. So these are and Iceland, of course. So those are the 8 Arctic states. And there are a lot of countries that have interest in the Arctic region, but they're not Arctic powers, and they're trying to wiggle their way into some of the policy making in the region. So when you have this increase of economic activity taking place, you have advancements in technology, which has allowed greater extraction of natural resources in the region. And then you overlay all of that with the great power competition that's going on. That's why we're more focused on the Arctic region now than perhaps we were in the past.
So in your January 2020 report for the Heritage Foundation, you mentioned that there were 4 main U.S. Arctic security interests. Could you explain what they are and why are they important to U.S. national security?
Yeah, that's right. I highlighted 4 security interests for the U.S. in the Arctic. The U.S. has many interests that are pretty broad when it comes to the Arctic, including environmental and energy issues, indigenous welfare issues. But in terms of America's narrow security interests, I say the 4 are ensuring the territorial defense of the United States. And I point out that this is particularly important with the proliferation of ballistic missiles. And that is why our cooperation with Canada, but also Greenland and Iceland are so important, because Greenland and Iceland play an important role regarding the defense of the North American continent. The second interest is enforcing U.S. sovereignty in the region. And I always put in my writings about the Arctic that sovereignty equals stability and security. Respecting the national sovereignty of others while being able to enforce your own sovereignty will bring stability and decrease the chances of armed conflict, in my opinion. And some of these areas are very remote, especially in northern Alaska, and the U.S. has to have the ability to demonstrate that it can protect this territory and look after the people living there. And then the third interest is meeting the treaty obligations in the Arctic region through NATO. 5 of the world's 8 Arctic countries are in NATO, and then another 2 Arctic countries, Finland and Sweden, are not in NATO, but they have a very close relationship with NATO. But sadly, NATO as an institution has been unable to agree to a strategy on the Arctic. In many cases, they refuse to even use the word Arctic in official documents. For example, in the last summit declaration and in the most recent strategic concept, which the strategic concept is sort of NATO's strategy document, you cannot even find the word Arctic being used. And that's because there's an internal dispute inside NATO between Canada and Norway about what NATO's role should be in the region. And then the fourth interest is ensuring the free flow of shipping and other economic activities in the region. I really believe that economic freedom leads to prosperity, and prosperity leads to security. And with melting ice creating new economic and shipping opportunities, it is in America's interest to ensure that no country tries to violate international norms when it comes to restricting the use of international waters and shipping lanes.
So can you describe why Russia poses such a security challenge for the U.S. in the region, and what are their activities and goals for the region?
Yeah, of course. Well, Russia accounts for half of the world's Arctic coastline. It probably accounts for half of the Arctic region's population. There are no official population figures for those living above the Arctic Circle, but good estimates put it at about 4 million people, which for your listeners to compare it to, it's roughly the size of Los Angeles. So half of those probably live in Russia. And Russia has always viewed the region as a region of a national importance. And what is Russia doing today that's so threatening? Well, Russia is definitely militarizing the Arctic. They're investing greatly in new military bases, naval bases, airfields on remote islands. They're taking old bases that were used during the Cold War and that were since closed down and reopening them. They're placing more specialized Arctic fighting units in the region. They're hardening their equipment to be able to operate in extreme cold weather and Arctic conditions. And this is fine as long as Russia does this inside its borders. It's Russia's prerogative to do as they like in their part of the Arctic region. But the concern lies when you look at what Russia's doing in other regions of the world outside of their borders, whether this is in Georgia or Ukraine or Syria or Libya. Russia has a tendency to use military force to advance national interests outside of its borders, and there is no reason to automatically exclude the Arctic for this. I mean, military planners should assume that this could be a region where the Arctic could be a region where Russia would act militarily to advance its interests if it felt like it had to. And there is also this sort of nostalgia that many in Russia have about the Arctic. And the Arctic is a region where Vladimir Putin can really get public support and increase his popularity at a very low cost. Because remember, as long as he does all of this militarization of the region inside his borders, there's really not much the U.S. or NATO can or should do about it, but we should certainly be aware of it.
You also mentioned China in your January 2020 Heritage Foundation report. What have they been doing in the region? Because while they are not one of the 8 countries that share land in the Arctic, we have seen Chinese activities in the region increase in the last couple of years. So what are China's main goals and what is it doing in the Arctic?
Yeah, China has a lot of interest in the Arctic because it is a global power, it is a major economic power, and it has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So I don't think anyone should deny that China doesn't have an interest in the Arctic region, but we should never pretend that they are an Arctic power. China has come up with this new phrase. They like to call themselves as a, quote, near Arctic state, unquote. This term is completely made up by Beijing. It's not found in the lexicon of Arctic discourse. The closest point of China to the Arctic Circle is 800 nautical miles. So by extending Beijing's logic to other countries in the world, it would mean that countries like Belarus, Estonia, Germany, Ireland, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Latvia, the Netherlands, Poland, the United Kingdom are also near Arctic states. And when we think of the Arctic, we hardly think of Kazakhstan or Ireland, right? China does this because they want to create new norms, new international standards so that they can get more involved in the institutional decision making in the Arctic region. And the main forum for this is the Arctic Council, where China is an observer without voting rights, but they would like to go beyond the observer status and have more power and influence in the region. In terms of what China's interests are, they're very interested in new shipping routes, of course, going from Europe to Asia using the Northern Sea Route. And the Northern Sea Route is the route that goes along the Russian coast through the Arctic, which is becoming more and more open due to decreasing ice in the summer. But it really hasn't met the expectations that many were hoping for.